Just a reminder.
Hi there, I'm Laura Brandis, and I'm the Communications Director at the POLIS Water Sustainability Project at the University of Victoria. And I want to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the third in this year's Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series. And I know a number of you on the line have joined us at our previous webinar, so I certainly welcome those of you who have been with us for a while. I welcome you back. The goal of this series is to bring together people from all sectors of the water field from across the country. We come together and we engage with emerging and innovative ideas in water policy and governance. Today's webinar is largely inspired by the Canada West Foundation report called Wave of the Future, Water Policy in Western Canada. And some of you may already be familiar with this report. It was one of the links in the pre-webinar reading materials that was circulated with your login information. The report synthesizes the views heard at 4 water roundtables held across Western Canada last spring, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that in just a few minutes. Now, before we get into the real meat and potatoes of the webinar, I do want to first say thank you to all of our partners and sponsors, particularly the Canadian Water Network, also the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation, University of Victoria and the Centre of Global Studies, which is where the POLIS project is housed, Water Canada Magazine, the Living Water Policy Project, and with regards to this particular webinar, I do want to say a special thank you to Canada West Foundation and in particular Larissa Sommerfeld for her help coordinating their end of the contributions to today's presentations. So before we begin, I want to really quickly go over some ground rules. I know that sounds a little bit harsh, but just a couple things to keep in mind. First is the audio. I have you all muted right now. The reason for that is to remove any extraneous background noise so that you can hear the presenters. If for some reason you can see in the list by your phone number that you're unmuted, you can always press *6 to mute your line. And for those of you who've been with us before, you know that I'll interrupt if need be, if we can't hear. So the way that the questions work, there's a chat box, which some of you are already using, in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. So if you have questions about either of the presentations, you can just type your question in there. I would recommend that you do it at the end of both presentations. The reason for this is just so that I can keep track of the questions so they don't get buried in the chat box if you enter them early on. And all of the questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. I'll read them out, and both Oliver and Roger will be on the line to answer those. And now the last thing, I'd love for all of you to introduce yourselves using that chat box, if you wouldn't mind just saying who you are, what organization you're with, and also how many people are listening on your end, if it's just you or if you have a group of people. This will help us to just get a sense of the community that we have in the room here today. And as you introduce yourselves, I'm going to introduce today's speakers. So first on the docket is Dr. Roger Gibbins. He's President and CEO of Canada West Foundation, and he's also a faculty professor of political science at the University of Calgary. He's authored, co-authored, or edited over 100 books and articles, mostly dealing with Western Canadian themes and issues. And he's also been presented with multiple awards for excellence in public administration and public policy. And we're certainly thrilled to have him here with us today. And our second speaker today hails from right here at the POLIS Project. Oliver Brandis is co-director of the University of Victoria's POLIS Project on Ecological Governance. And he's also project lead on the POLIS Water Sustainability Project. His current work focuses on water sustainability, sound resource management, and ecologically based legal and institutional reform. And today he'll be discussing the current water policy landscape in British Columbia, particularly focusing on the province's Water Act modernization process. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Roger. So Roger, if you don't mind pressing *6 on your telephone, that should bring you onto the line.
Okay.
Okay, fantastic. Take it away.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Laura, and good morning to everyone. I'd like to begin by underscoring Laura's thanks to Larissa Sommerfeld, who's really our policy wizard at the Canada West Foundation, and I think she's on the line. I'm reporting on a series of roundtables that we held across Western Canada in the spring of spring of 2011 now. The roundtable discussions were titled the Honourable James A. Richardson Discovery Roundtables. The idea was to try to look at policy issues that are sort of on the horizon, but not the center point of current discussion. And water seemed to be one of those issues that fit so well within that. So we brought together about 50 individuals who were involved in one way or another with water management. People who were running water systems, who were involved in governance, people who were academics. The 50 people gathered for dinner conversations in Victoria, Lethbridge, Saskatoon, and Winnipeg. When we met in Victoria, we were fortunate to have the cooperation of Oliver and Mike McGonigal, who helped us pull together the group and pitched in a very big way in the discussion. Now, we had the option of focusing on just about any topic we wanted to, so the issue is why water? And we believe it really has the potential to become the defining issue for Western Canada in the coming years. There's an intense debate that's beginning to emerge about water management, but it's also a debate that's informed and to an extent accelerated by an international debate about water shortages and water management. And what this means is that there's a moral obligation, it seems, on Western Canadians to be better water stewards, even if by being better water stewards we don't materially affect parts of the world where water is more of an issue and where shortages are more acute. We're interested in whether there are water policy issues that are common across the 4 Western provinces. This is a perennial question for the Canada West Foundation. You know, is there a regional policy theme or a regional policy framework, or are we really 4 very different provinces? And it's always something that we're interested in trying to explore. We realize that there are idiosyncratic issues for each of the 4 Western provinces, unavoidably so, but nonetheless we're looking for and interested in whether there are broader sort of thematic challenges that reach across the region. So on the screen right now you see the 4 guiding questions we used for the dinner conversations. As you can imagine from your own dinner conversations, the guiding questions did not overly constrain our participants, and the conversation sort of roamed around and around in different ways. But nonetheless, it was a very invigorated, a very active discussion, and certainly one that I enjoyed tremendously. Now, as I mentioned before, there were differences across the four Western provinces, as you would expect. In Manitoba, for example, tremendous concentration on challenges facing Lake Winnipeg. BC always has a somewhat different water profile than the prairie provinces, but nonetheless, despite differences, local differences, and differences in terms of climatic challenges, in terms of the potential impact of climate change, there were some regional themes that rippled throughout the conversation. And what I'd like to do now is turn to some of those big regional themes. The first we've titled Planning for the Unknown. It's recognized, at least among the 50 people we talked to, that the past is not a particularly good predictor of the future in terms of water availability, water usage, water planning. At the same time, however, there's no clear trajectory in terms of water developments. We know that climate change will be a game changer. We know that water will affect all kinds of other policy areas. It will affect our economy, it will affect our society, it will affect human health and the environment. But at the same time, the nature of that impact is hard to predict at this time. And therefore, sort of paradoxically, there is a need to plan, to think more holistically and to think more aggressively about what the water future of Western Canada might look like. Second point then is the issue about what we've called muddy waters. Planning works best when there's good data. Good data is not really characteristic of the water scene in Western Canada. There's a lot of holes, I guess, in the data. A lot of areas where individual groups, organizations, academic researchers are plugging holes, but the integration of that knowledge base is not as great as it could be. There's also a sense that the water research community is not as well connected with the water policy community and with government as could be the case. And this is a challenge that takes place across the environmental sector. We know a lot at the academic level. We know a lot in terms of the research community. We know a lot in terms of individual watersheds. But getting that knowledge into the policy process is a challenge. And just incidentally, this is something that we are working on in the Canada West Foundation now, trying to figure out how to improve the inflow, if you want, of evidence and scientific material into the policy process. A big issue that came up time and time again was related to the challenges of governance. Recognize that we are dealing with jurisdictional fragmentation, and that fragmentation is both vertical in the sense that the federal government, provincial and territorial governments, local governments all have a piece of the policy pie. It's also fragmented horizontally, and that is that water systems reach across jurisdictions in ways that complicate policymaking in a very major way. It was pointed out, for example, that what happens in Alberta with respect to water use has a direct impact on water policy and water issues in the Northwest Territories. We are all, in a sense, upstream and downstream from somebody. And in Western Canada, and particularly in the Prairie Provinces, you see water systems that reach across jurisdictions. So people were very acutely aware of governance challenges, not quite the same as having a solution, but nonetheless very aware. There was a broad recognition of the need in the policy world to more systematically value natural capital and to put a value of some sort on aquatic natural capital. Now, this is an easier message to accept, I guess, than to operationalize, because figuring out how to establish that value, how to put sort of hard numbers to it, is something that still bedevils the policy community, but something which people are working on quite vigorously. So what we find is that there is a general acceptance of the need to move in this direction, if not yet a general acceptance about how we might move in that sense. That took us into a discussion of pricing and water management practices. And here again it gets fairly complicated, because there's a belief that water is best managed on a local scale, but managed within a regional and provincial frameworks, and indeed perhaps managed within a larger federal framework that establishes national standards. There was certainly an interest in pricing water, although we found from our own work that this is still a highly contentious, highly difficult field to move in. We've been working in the area for, I guess, about 3 years now, and progress is there, but it's not as readily available as I had thought 3 years earlier on. There was an optimistic statement that popped up in many of the roundtables, had to do with removing politics from decision making. Given that I'm a political scientist, I'm never sure about the possibility or even desirability of removing politics from decision making on water. But nonetheless, there was a feeling that somehow there's a body of expertise that should be brought more vigorously into play, and that we're not using as much of it as we could. A lot of discussion about the external world. What do Western Canadians think about when water issues emerge? And I think there's a general consensus across the roundtables that the public awareness of water issues is not as high as it could be. Something that experts argue in a whole variety of fields, of course. And then also a very interesting discussion of the gap between urban and rural electorates in terms of water usage. So Western Canada is a very heavily urbanized society. The water issues often hit with greater impact on rural communities. But the rural communities, of course, do not have the political clout that the large urban electorates have. And so there's some discussion about how do we make sure that the urban electorate is aware of the water challenges that are playing out across the rural landscape. Now, it's hard to imagine that there's anything we didn't talk about, but indeed there were a number of things that didn't pop up. And these are important, I think, in terms of the context within which water policy is discussed. So there's no implication of, or no discussion of bulk water exports, very little discussion of private sector involvement in water services, not a lot of discussion about the sort of practicalities or the individual nature of conservation practices. The water energy nexus, which is becoming so important in some parts of the region, was not raised very much. No discussion really of water as a human right, and little discussion about water at the municipal level. There was kind of episodic discussion about a national water strategy. That discussion was kind of embryonic but positive in character. And there was some discussion about water challenges affecting Canada's Aboriginal population, and then also how to involve or include the Aboriginal population in the governance issues that are so important. So in conclusion, a sense of optimism about the future. People were not despondent about the water challenges facing the Western provinces. There was a thought that more effective water management would pay off in some very concrete ways, economically, socially, environmentally. There was a caution that decision makers shouldn't be overwhelmed by the water challenges, that small steps are still small steps in the right direction, and a real belief that water will be a defining issue for Western Canada in the coming years, and something that can be addressed effectively across the four Western provinces. So our work is available on the website on your screen, and I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm delighted to turn things over to Oliver. Thank you very much.
So I hear from my phone that the mute is off. Can you confirm this, Laura, perhaps?
Yep, I can hear you, so everyone else should be able to as well.
Yep.
Great. Thank you so much, Roger. That was a fantastic overview, and I think what was so fascinating about being involved in that process was the diversity of perspectives and the range of the discussion, but yet that there were certain sort of cementing and common themes. I guess that provides a really good context for me to enter the discussion, which is I'm going to be a little more focused on British Columbia and some of the developments here. But I think, as many of you will come to realize, the issues that are at play and the discussions and the issues or the context that are pushing policy changes and some of the legal and institutional reforms are very similar wherever we go, and that's a fascinating piece. So that's maybe a theme we can pick up on when we hit the discussion stage. So for my discussion here, I want to hit on three main points. Number one, that water is a strategic asset increasing in importance and crucial to community and economic prosperity. So again, I think that echoes very much what Roger was indicating that was heard in the roundtable. I think number two, now to focus it on British Columbia, we can see that British Columbians care about water and agree we need to ensure its protection. And this is an important context because this is what will frame some of my discussion about the policy directions and, importantly, the water law reform initiatives that are currently going on. And as you can see by my great numbering system, I have two number ones and one number two. So the other number one is that water laws and governance need to change more in the next 10 years than they have in over the last 100 years. And again, I think that echoes the themes that Roger touched on, that there are a lot of really tough nuts in there. They're really emerging as priorities for people, and to address these, a whole host of things will need to change. So here we go. So my overview, just so you know what you'll be hearing, is, again, my numbering system seems to have gone a little haywire, but number one will be just an overview of the context and drivers for water policy and law reform in British Columbia. Now, to British Columbians, some of this will seem so painfully obvious. I put some of these slides in just to give some context for people who were perhaps not here, but I think what's interesting is people will see that those themes are pretty much universal. The other number one is overview of BC's Living Water Smart Plan and its current process to modernize its Water Act. And I think this is very fascinating for a couple of reasons. One, I'm involved in the process, and therefore it's always interesting to see the process of creating new legislation or reforming legislation. The analogy is sometimes that to sausage making. So sometimes you know you like the sausage, but you may not want to see what happens as they make it. And finally, number three is on the horizon. So these are the issues that I think are going to be really hot topics in the coming periods, and so things that we should all be aware of. Some of them are very BC focused, but I think the themes really are almost universal again, and I think you'll find that interesting. So here we go. As anyone who's seen my presentations in the past, you'll know that that's how I like to sum it up, right? The trouble with water, and there is trouble with water, is that they aren't making any more of it. Wonderful book by Mark de Villers, and I think it was a really important book because it really, to me, set off the next generation of conversation and engagement around water. It was released in about 1999, and since then a whole host of people and groups have been gotten involved in water issues in a whole different way. So now I have about 3 or 4 slides that look kind of like this, and these are all the nice punchy headlines that give you a sense. And I was going to pull these out at the last minute, but decided that I would keep them in because our new researcher, Jesse Baltutis, who works with us, put a lot of effort to putting these together, and I thought it would just give everybody a flavor of the kinds of issues that are really driving the water issues here in BC, and really fine-tuning that sense of urgency that there is a real concern. So obviously scarcity and drought, you know, even though BC is a very, as some would suggest, as Canada is, a water-wealthy place, there are very acute and very specific issues, and they range, and they're all over the province, you know, from the interior where you would expect it to be a little bit dry, but also to places like Tofino in the middle of the rainforest, where they will almost, well, literally had to shut things down because they ran out of water. Then you have conflict, which is an emerging issue, which is not really surprising in a way, because as the challenges and the uncertainty and the changes in the hydrological cycle become more acute, conflict inevitably follows. And this is the range, and It starts from, the different role of government where they have to start playing the heavy hand in some situations, to concern by various regional or watershed level groups about certain commitments not being implemented, all the way to First Nations being very concerned that either their rights are being infringed or that the current process isn't sufficient to protect this important resource. And then we got the other side of drought is floods. So this is that adage that one often hears in the water field: too much or too little, rarely the right amount at the right times. And these are some of the challenges, which all builds this idea that, again, Roger picked up on or sort of alluded to, that uncertainty is increasing. And so we have to build more resilient systems, either ecologically and socially, to begin addressing those challenges. And finally, the one that everyone talks about are infrastructure and drinking water concerns. Again, Walkerton was a huge event that helped coalesce this sort of next generation of water engagement, but I think that kind of problem could become more common, especially when you think about the very many boil water warnings, of which BC is among the leaders in Canada. So an unfortunate stat to be ahead on. So that gives you just a very quick sense of the mounting problems and increasing water use conflicts in BC. In addition to that, what we have seen over the last decade certainly is that there are many what I'm calling water governance experiments and evolutions across Canada and internationally that are driving things. And this is very important for British Columbia because as it looks to its either neighboring jurisdictions or other leading state-of-the-art jurisdictions all around the world, they're seeing a whole bunch of different approaches, and this has been an important part of the backdrop of what has been driving some of the changes here. Obviously, the recognition that water is an important resource, but that it's becoming really top of mind to many British Columbians, and the demand to ensure long-term health of watersheds and related resources is really critical. The other one that we all know, anyone in the field knows, that as the climate changes, it will have a direct impact on our hydrological cycle, which means, as I suggested, an emphasis on resilience, and that means new institutions and approaches to begin thinking about how we're going to resolve that. And now we have a theme that really is cross-cutting. I mean, you can hardly turn on the news nowadays without hearing about some series of protests or concerns or rallying around the idea that citizens want to be more engaged in decision-making. And water is a really important aspect of that because that's where we're seeing increasingly citizens, because of its fundamental nature, want to really have a say and input, and they want to play a role in this decision-making. And finally, mapped on all these challenges is we see a world where government is changing and capacity is obviously diminishing. I've heard this wonderful phrase of when sort of peak oil and peak resources, well, peak government. And I have some colleagues that have retired over the last 10 or 15 years or so, and they all maintain peak government was roughly when they retired. But it's certainly in the mid to late 90s, it was pretty clear that the government was much more able to be an active, engaged entity, and it decreased in recent times. And this means that new actors are beginning to enter the field. So just to pick up on this idea of the evolving water governance across Canada, we have this history of top-down, state-driven regulatory approaches, very much the case in British Columbia. We've seen some experimentation, as in Alberta, with markets, which is something that's innovative, very contentious, a great deal of concern about what the implications of that are, but it is nonetheless a new governance innovation, if you will, and something that's on the landscape. And importantly, though, something that's certainly increasingly across Canada and other places is an emphasis on collaborative approaches and partnerships. And this idea internationally, where there's been a great deal of leadership towards this sharing of responsibility and authority. And from BC's perspective, what's happened is we've seen a number of places like Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, and Northwest Territories have really made these commitments and to new approaches and begun this formal move to a different kind of governance process. So this is a really point of emphasis as British Columbia begins to address some of those challenges that you have a flavor for. Now this wonderful picture captures a somewhat recent, I can't even really say it's that recent anymore, but it's a 2010, so late 2010, November 2010 Water Attitudes Poll that was commissioned and delivered by the Vancouver Foundation and WWF Canada. It was done by McAllister Opinion Research, and it was specific to BC. And I think, so number one, you can see in the image, these are some of the key words that people associate with water, so you can see a real strong life and health component, but there's a number of sort of ecological elements. But what's interesting about this poll and this polling is it shows that it really is top of mind to many folks. And I'm just going to hit a couple of high notes. I'm sure some of you have already seen some of this data, but it's important to emphasize, really. Number one, 98% of BC residents recognize that fresh water is critical to their well-being. That seems kind of like an obvious statement, but anyone who knows British Columbians, we don't really agree on anything. So to get 98% is very significant. I doubt we would even get 98% agreement that, say, gravity exists or the Earth is not flat. So it really is a significant kind of commitment. In addition, 91% agree that freshwater is BC's most precious resource. Let me emphasize that, most precious resource. So really ahead of things like oil and gas and the number of mining and those sort of more forestry, which is an important economic driver. 6 in 10 also feel that the current governance system is not enough to ensure future sustainability. And again, protecting nature is seen as a primary priority, especially during times of water scarcity, with the majority even saying that it's more important than jobs in many cases. So that's a really critical point. And finally, the majority strongly supporting new rules for water governance. So again, this is a critical part. It goes to my story here of the priority and the emphasis and the need for significant change around water here in British Columbia. And this is part of that backdrop of the changes that are happening. So let's give you a moment to take in this little collage. This is my collage of what's happened in BC and how we got to the Water Act. And you can see by the disparate components there, some stuff are obvious, like in the west here we have a strong sort of salmon connection, and most of you know how salmon work. They need water and good, healthy watershed to operate in. But there were a number of elements. So we have this sort of strong water and sort of supernatural BC kind of component. We have that mapped on with things like shrinking glaciers, increasing droughts. We have, the bottom left there, fish drying up in the stream. So we're getting the sense of a little bit of a crisis. We add on that, we had a premier at the time that was very interested in a fellow down south that I like to call the Governor, who had this green streak. So this green emphasis really became important, in addition to a strong sense of protest and citizen engagement in British Columbia, and this overall sense that the times, they are a-changing, and not only climate, but institutions and role for government. And a couple of real events that really helped highlight that were the big windstorm events in Stanley Park that really captured concern in a unique way. So all this mapped together to really drive a period of significant policy change, and that's what led to the release of, in 2008, of the Living Water Smart, which is British Columbia's water plan. And an important part of this to understand is, number one, it's a wonderful statement of intent. It really captures a comprehensive vision and a number of very specific commitments to getting to a whole new paradigm. Important, so released in 2008, not just the Ministry of Environment, which is kind of a big deal because it came as a cross-government initiative, but also out of the Premier's office. And I think that's really important because it captures how water isn't just an environmental issue anymore. It cuts into economic and social policy, and it's something that reaches the desk of the Premier, so that's important. And in fact, some of this, sense of issues and challenges was what helped the Council of the Federation's priority on water and the development of their water charter. And the Council of Federation, I'm sure many know, but not all, that is the space where all the premiers from all 13 territories and provinces gather, and they identify issues that are sort of cross-cutting importance that sort of reach the Premier's desk, and water is one of those. So again, it's an important component, and the activities of British Columbia and this strategy helped coalesce some of that. In addition, what we see is, what's nice about this is over 40 specific commitments with dates, many of them starting this very year in 2012. So, we as citizens and those in the policy and research field can begin to see if there's progress being made and if we can hold government to account. So we'll talk a bit about the good, the bad, and the ugly associated with this. As with many policy statements, the rhetoric is actually quite good. on the positive end, I'm going to say the blueprint, it is a blueprint for real provincial change. So it really does show a new business as usual, as I say. And it, like I said, it has some vision and very clear commitments. And it emphasizes a number of aspects, which I think at the time were certainly novel. It was very interesting, the level of commitment and the codification, but it was recognizing that climate change adaptation was critical, that climate change was real and was going to have impact on waters. It emphasized stream health and proper watershed function. So it took a real ecological component and raised it up. Usually environmental issues, especially when we're talking about these things that are sort of cross-government in priority, tend to have a more economic-driven focus. Well, here they're recognizing that the ecological component is actually a critical underpinning. It began that really critical step out west that we need is that move to conservation and efficiency. So it begins to talk about how you mainstream or streamline that into doing business in a standard way, is to incorporate conservation and efficiency. And finally, I mean, certainly people in the water field have for a long time maintained that it's so critical to integrate land and water that we in fact know that the activities that happen on the landscape show up in the water, so we have to integrate. So it really is a strong statement to show a new business as usual and offers a potential model for Canada. So there's the language, the rhetoric is right, the commitments are wonderful, it's very useful for a policy document to have very specific dates, and we'll talk about some of that in a little bit of detail shortly. But there's, as with these things, it's slow going at times. Number one, it relies heavily on voluntary actions. So to me, always a good proof is in the pudding comes when there's dollars, people, or resources to follow through on the commitments. We haven't seen that, partially because of the economic changes that we've seen globally and government really trying to find its footing in its new role as a really smaller institution. So I question sometimes, does the rhetoric match reality? Show me the money and will help us understand where the commitments will be delivered. Minimal capacity to deliver even existing commitments. So it's not like this policy came in a void. There were a number of very significant developments, whether it was drinking water legislation or a number of provisions that were added to the old Water Act that could be acted on. Very good planning provisions, a number of legal and institutional tools, and us here at POLIS have done a lot of analysis on that and shown that there are a number of tools in the toolbox, but yet they're rarely deployed. So adding on top of that a whole bunch of additional commitments and promises is a challenge. From my perspective of dealing with governance issues, you always want to see what formal mechanisms for accountability and good governance are in place. Those are good clues that people are serious, and right now we're not seeing the formal mechanisms for accountability and reform of governance and institutions. So it doesn't build that social resilience that I'm alluding to that needs to be built to enable the kinds of changes. So at this point, there are largely promises that the only real accountability mechanism is, throw the buggers out if it's not coming to fruition. You would like to see in a more sophisticated regime a number of indicators and a number of processes that would help support. And finally, I think it is the symptom of a much broader problem, which is really the idea of a whole system, whole watershed approaches, where you're talking about, municipal zoning decisions, and you're talking about resource development and economic development decisions and energy policies that all capture this integrated process in a way that really pays attention to not only the function of the watershed, but the healthy water systems. And naturally, in a place like Canada, with its federation, that's a real challenge because of the many layers of government when we're talking about First Nations government, municipal government, provincial, and federal. So one of the big promises that came out of this big process is Water Act modernization, WAM. And I really emphasize that as the opportunity, because this will be the first real test of the commitments and the sort of the will of government and I guess broader society really as reflected to do things quite differently. So here are a number of the very specific commitments, as you can see, all pretty much by 2012, so that's this year, where we'll hopefully see some of these changes. Water laws will improve the protection of ecological values, provide for more community involvement, and provide incentives to be efficient. And it's very clear what that means. Legislation will recognize water flow requirements for ecosystem and species. groundwater protection. So that's important. Not everybody may know this, but British Columbia has no regulation of groundwater. So they're saying, we're going to begin changing that. We're going to take an ecological view and understand that surface water and groundwater are connected and begin regulating that. And they're going to start with large user and priority areas. And finally, the idea of reporting. So seeing, are we making progress? What's the state and health of the watersheds? And are we making progress? So these are very important and very specific commitments. So now, let me take a moment. I'm going to catch my breath here for a sec. And we're going to move through what the Water Act currently is and where it's going, and I hope that's useful for folks. So number one, the current BC Water Act is over 100 years old. It had a primary purpose to facilitate gold and mining and agricultural development. And really, to be fair, it served its purpose. It created a certainty for investment, and it was really quite valuable for its time. Now, 100 years is a long time ago. It's important to recognize also it really was not an environmental law. It really is a resource extraction law. It's about the rules and processes to extract resources, i.e. water, from the system for a whole bunch of economic developments. And the way it's structured, I really call it the Lords of Yesterday, and that's the little image there, that it's highly discretionary, it's uncoordinated, and not related to ecological function. So these Lords of Yesterday really still control many of the water decisions that are happening today. And this was an important piece of what needs to be updated. There's a number of key principles that underpin the current Water Act. I'm not going to go into detail here. The first, again, to the folks in the West, this is probably pretty common knowledge, but not everybody knows this. First in time, first in right. I call it the kindergarten principle. Anyone who went to kindergarten knows the rule. If I had it first, I get to keep it. Well, that's kind of how water is organized here. The people who had allocated the water first get to keep it. So in times of drought, the most junior, so the newest water license gets cut off first, and it gets cut off in its entirety. So if I have an old license, I get all my water before the younger license does. Again, it's a great system when there's lots of water. It's a problematic system when we're running out of water because it means that some people have to really deal with very significant impacts. And there's a couple other principles here that really are connected and I think are really important going forward. Number one, water is and has always been vested in the Crown. So there's going to be some, I guess, importance because when the government decides through public policy and some process to change the rules, the implications for compensation are significant. But given that it's always been vested in the Crown, it's only been ever rights to use, that has implications. The other two things that I find very interesting are the idea of beneficial use and the use it or lose it principle, and they're kind of linked. The use it or lose it is related to that you should be using your water in what's considered a beneficial way. Now, beneficial use has never been properly defined, so we don't know what that means. In BC, in practice, it's come to mean, do you pay your fees? But the problem with use it or lose it is it doesn't really provide an incentive to conserve, because if you conserve, it means you're not using it, and means you could lose some or all of your allotment. Now, this is an important component as British Columbia begins to modernize its Water Act, because beneficial use would offer a real opportunity by defining that in a way that's consistent with some of the modern values like conservation and protecting ecosystems. That component can help drive some of those positive changes. I see this diagram has gone a little haywire. I had to email my presentation from various airports across North America, so some of it may have gone a little haywire. But this is just an image that captures basically what we're talking about, moving from an allocation system, and the top pictures you would just see over time an ever-increasing human component of use, with the inevitable event, which is happening in many places across Canada, including BC, that some water systems become fully allocated, to a whole different approach where you start saying, no, the environment is actually a legitimate user and we're going to ensure a certain component, and then human use is a subset of that. So in the proposed new act, which is tentatively being called the Water Sustainability Act, there are 4 stated goals, and those are consistent with the water strategy, putting a real ecological sort of lens onto this new Water Act. Is the idea of protecting stream health and aquatic environments, improving water governance arrangements, introducing more flexibility and efficiency in the water allocation system, and regulating groundwater extraction and use. We could probably do a whole webinar just on the new Water Act, and maybe that's something we'll do one day, but I won't go into much further detail except for to say that the process to date really has been cutting edge. There's been extensive public consultation. It started in 2010. It's been ongoing. There's been at least 2 formal rounds to date. There's a very clear process. One gets the sense that government really is listening. Over 2,000 formal submissions related to the Water Act, so you can see a whole community of folks really engaging. And I think that the efforts, the public consultation efforts are seen as cutting edge and have been certainly viewed in the water community, in the water policy community, as highly credible. So I think many of the inputs have been very positive. Now, hopefully, the delivery of what's promised will be there. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and just touch on what I'm calling on the water horizon for BC. So these are issues that I'm calling, they're not if, but when. So these are, in my mind, these are no doubters. These are going to happen. They're going to happen, I'm going to guess, in my lifetime. And they're going to matter. They're going to matter a whole lot. So number one, we're going to see this move, and we're already sort of witnessing it. It's been a little bit awkward at first, but this idea of moving from government to governance, so moving away from the idea of government as the top-down manager of these resources to a whole host of players very significantly playing a role. And we see the foreshadowing of that in the policy realm, where we're seeing policy actors, whether it's industry or business or civil society, engaging in the public policy realm around water in a whole different way. And the natural extension of that is the idea that it's going to be shared decision-making and collaborative watershed governance will be an important feature of how water is governed and managed ultimately, and how those decisions are made. So scale will really matter, and the role of watersheds, and the idea that folks who are sharing a watershed actually have a lot in common and have a lot of incentives to work together. So the next thing that I'm going to say is that's on the landscape, and to be fair, I suspect that certainly within our lifetimes it's going to be on the landscape for pretty much all the jurisdictions across Canada, and that's the idea of a Modern Water Act. Legislation is an important part of how society codifies its rules, and it captures its approaches and a vehicle for how business is done. And I think that, as I alluded to in the early part, there's a strong appetite for a new approach, for new rules, for new sense of priority of water. And I identify a number of components of what a Modern Water Act looks like. And, you know, in different ways and over different time frames, we will see these changes. And certainly the role of water for nature will become a very critical driver in how water is managed. And so it'll start likely with legislated environmental flows. The idea of protecting the water cycle, recognizing that the water cycle is an important component, and that means that surface and groundwater is linked, and that needs to be protected together. Number three is the idea of enabling the sharing of water and the resolution of disputes. The idea of, like, what I call the kindergarten principle, the first in time, first in right, really what it does is it embeds disputes. It creates problems, because when you have a drought or you're water limited, there's going to be an inevitable tension. So when times are difficult, it's time to share the pain, and that idea of sharing and then the resolution of those disputes becomes really critical. The idea that those affected need to have a say in the decisions is an increasingly important priority, and certainly if you look at internationally and certainly throughout the Arab countries, the role of society to say, no, we want to play an active role is increasingly important. In British Columbia, where in many places or in many cases Aboriginal rights and title are not fully resolved, that's a critical starting point for how those impacted are going to have a critical say. Finally, that there are a number of really good formal, what I call policy wonkish components, but they're really critical because that's what lays the groundwork. These are process elements, but they're so critical, and that's embedding better planning. It's with really useful plans that have legislative teeth and implications if you break the plan. The idea of accountability, so when promises are made, are people held to account, and then oversight mechanisms that really are meaningful. And the final one that I really believe is going to be on the landscape is the codification of the public trust doctrine. So this current process in British Columbia is contemplating the idea of formally codifying the public trust, but in addition, so that's putting the language in an actual statute. But in addition, as we see the courts are beginning to increasingly play with this notion in Canada with a 2004 British Columbia case called CAN4. It had to deal with forestry, but the court alluded to the idea that in many cases government is only holding a resource in trust for future generations. So it is not free to make any and all decisions to either degrade or impact that resource for future generations. So the idea of this trust relationship becomes very critical. And it's certainly a well-developed component of how a number of resources, including water, are managed in the United States and certainly internationally. This will be an important component of what I see in certainly the West and perhaps across Canada. And then what I call the next generation of transboundary agreements. In British Columbia, we have a big one coming up. The Columbia Basin Treaty has the potential to be opened up and renegotiated. I think the decision needs to be made by about 2014. And what we will see, if it does open up, is that we'll see a whole new generation of these kinds of transboundary agreements. A number of the institutions like the IJC and others have been deemed to be really valuable and really effective institutions and have been around for a long time. I think in these next round we're going to see a number of new transboundary agreements that are going to capture certainly the leading edge from internationally, where we see a number of principles, things like the precautionary principle and others embedded in a way that will really emphasize the idea of ecological function and long-term sharing of an important resource. And finally, I think I'm almost finally there, is we're talking about the water energy nexus. Certainly you can hardly open up a newspaper in British Columbia without hearing some issue related to this. And I noticed that in Roger's slides, he mentioned that was one of the topics that wasn't discussed. And that is actually very interesting because certainly in British Columbia, that's becoming a very active component. And it's a really simple notion. It's the idea that water and energy are actually intimately linked. Whether we're talking about producing energy, in many cases we need significant amounts of water, whether we're talking about things like run of the river or significant hydro projects, but even other processes like carbon-based oil and gas extraction requires significant amounts of water. The flip side of it is when you're moving water around or dealing with water, that takes a significant amount of energy. So when you're talking about water conservation, you're also talking about energy conservation. So there is really a strong nexus, and that's going to be an important driver in how a lot of decisions will be made over the next while. So just to wrap up here, there's a sense that there is really a simple set of things we need to do. The challenge is, getting it done. And really, it's quite simple because when you talk about water and it's a limited resource, you're talking about using less and use what we take more productively. You have to learn to share and resolve conflicts. So that's really the institutional and the governance component needs to be really modernized. You need to leave enough water in the system to ensure healthy watersheds and proper function. A very simple notion, hard to really establish what that magic number is, but it's an important component to think about. That ecological component is part of it. And then there's the societal element, which is changing the public attitude that water is a free good. Instead, view water as a strategic natural asset and a public trust. So this is a bundle, to me, is the challenge as we go forward. This last slide, I'm less optimistic that we'll see all this in my lifetime, but we can hope. So I think that's it for me.
All right, thank you, Oliver. So we're now going to move into the question period, and I'm going to ask Roger, I know you're on the line out there somewhere, if you don't mind pressing *6 to bring your voice back on. And also Larissa Sommerfeld is going to come on the line and join us as a panelist, as it were, for this course. So if you have questions, please start typing them in the chat box. As I said, I'll read them out as they're typed in, just to make sure everybody can hear them and knows what we're talking about. Now, while you guys are typing, I do want to bring your attention to two upcoming events that will both create important spaces where the dialogue and this evolving discussion around Western water policy will continue. POLIS has played a bit of an organizational role with both of these events, and Oliver actually will be a guest speaker at both of these as well. So the first, as you can see on your screen here, is a water gathering, collaborative watershed governance in BC and beyond. This one's taking place in Vancouver next week. 1 week from today is the start date. It's a 2-day event, and it's being hosted by the Pacific Business and Law Institute as well as the Summit Institute. And this is going to provide a space where governments, industry, civil society can all engage together in dialogue about watershed governance and specifically collaborative watershed governance. And it will feature panel sessions, question and discussion periods, and presentations from some of the leading thinkers on Canadian watershed governance. So if you're interested in that, as I said, it's coming up soon. You can head to that website at the bottom of your screen there to get more information if you're interested in registering. And the next one I want to quickly mention is the Building Sustainable Communities Conference from the Fresh Outlook Foundation. It will be in Kelowna from February 27th to March 1st. And there'll be more than 250 speakers and industry experts there addressing really a huge range of topics. But on the Tuesday, which is February 28th, there will be a session dedicated to water sustainability, things like water governance, water valuation and costing, sustainable infrastructure, water efficiency and conservation. So that's another one to keep an eye out for. All right, so we've had one question come in so far from Liz at WWF Canada. It says, just wondering how the CanWest report will inform their water program over the next few years. There has been great input by experts from across the West. It would be great to see something done with that knowledge. So Roger or Larissa, do you have any insight there?
Roger, are you on the line?
Oh, we may have lost Roger.
Okay, can you hear me, Laura?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks.
Welcome.
Yeah, I'll give a quick response, and Larissa may be able to respond at greater length. What we've been struggling with over the last year is precisely the question that was raised, and that is, how do we begin to weave the advice we've heard into a more coherent water research project within the Canada West Foundation. And so what we're trying to do is to answer that exactly that question. Larissa, I don't know if you have an answer ready for that.
Yeah. Hi, Liz. Yes, I am actually working on a project right now that's looking at Western Canada and the water stress points some of the water stress points that we're facing that are obviously linked to social and cultural issues, but the particular focus of this project is looking at how it's linked to economic issues. So I'm actually just finishing up my first draft of a broader front-end report this week. We're planning to have it out hopefully early February. And then we'll be following that report up with a series of shorter papers that will look at these, I guess, stress points in greater detail. So an example would be looking at shale gas development in northern BC or some of the water challenges in southern Alberta. And so, I mean, I would think that a lot of the issues that were raised in the roundtables are sort of your classic policy dilemmas. So we will be including some of the input that we received from the roundtables in this next project. And also just to mention that we have done a little bit of speaking already on this report. So in November, Roger and I spoke to the Alberta Irrigators Projects Association on the report. So if anything, this report on its own is stimulating some debate. So hopefully that answers your question.
I'm just going to jump in here for 1 sec. It's Oliver here. Two things. Number one, Liz, who asked the question, we need to also give her a special acknowledgement because she is actually the, in a sense, originator of this Blue Dialogue series. Back in the day when she worked with us here at POLIS, she was the one who created and initiated this whole program. So we want to thank her for that, and glad that she's still involved. And maybe I can add a follow-up question to both Roger and Larissa about that question, because I think one of the things that the majority of the people in the water research or the water policy community, I mean, we understand many of these themes and the issues, and in a sense, I think the research is fairly refined at this point. We know kind of what to do, but this is my question to you folks as sort of political scientists is, how does one put and keep water issues as a political priority? How does one keep these really complex, cross-cutting, wicked problems, as some people like to call them, something that politicians can stay on board with? Because I think that's the challenge. Many of these issues, they won't be resolved even in one term, and I think that's why, in a sense, many people kind of stay away from them. So this political question to me is a really critical one. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, even off the cuff. I would love to hear what your thoughts on that kind of an issue would be.
Well, yeah, Oliver, just a quick stab at it. I think the political agenda will tend to be crisis-driven on the waterfront as it is in so many areas. And so there will be response to floods, to drought, to all the things that we know are part of the water field. But getting the political will and attention to tackle these more systemic governance issues and so on, I think is going to be very difficult. It goes back, in my mind, to your reference earlier in your presentation to the notion of peak government. If we're in a situation where the capacity of governments, or even the willingness of governments to tackle big issues, is becoming diluted, and where governments are so preoccupied with debt and deficit issues, I think it's going to be very difficult. So in the Alberta case, which I perhaps know the best, what we see, I think, in the case of the provincial premier is an interest in water policy, but a less venturesome, a less holistic approach, because she's dealing with specific firefights on the land use policy within the province. So I'm not optimistic in being able to mobilize that kind of political will.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question here, unless any of you have anything more to add. The next question came in from Reg Witten, I believe, who's a watershed steward with the city of Dawson Creek. Given the current period of government services retraction in water stewardship, what analyses have been made to consider the kind of agency support requirements that will be required to implement the new Water Sustainability Act to support existing and new water source protection and water management plans, etc.? For example, research, inventories, regulatory compliance monitoring.
Well, I'm going to maybe pick up on that question. I think, Red, you might be getting a little ahead of yourself because we don't yet even have a sustainable water act. It's still very much a live and shifting process. This is the part where I mentioned the sausages and the sausage making. We're kind of in an ugly stage of the process now. In British Columbia, there's been a number of very significant political shifts that I think have challenged the process as set out in the initial vision. So as we know, our premier stepped down, a new premier came in, is trying to find her feet as far as which policy priorities she's going to really pick up on. We have an election due, as we have in British Columbia, the legislated in 2013. All of this conspires to create a little bit of uncertainty because I think the intention was to have the legislation mapped out at this stage already, but there's been at least three, it might even be four now, ministers of the environment since the actual Water Act reform process initiated. So all of that has really, I think, delayed, and we're still not, I think the outside community is still not entirely clear on what the actual priority elements are. And until we know what the elements are, it's hard to analyze or to suggest what the resource requirements will be. So to your point, I mean, there's a couple of key pieces. We know that groundwater regulation is coming. I mean, I think that's a no-brainer. I think that even my colleagues in government would agree with me there. With that may come some revenue streams, so that may be a component. It is clear that in priority areas, and I think the big mystery there is what will be a priority area. I mean, there's some obvious ones in British Columbia, in the interior, very dry drought areas, places like the Okanagan, will likely be considered a priority area, as might be the Gulf Islands. And there will be some resources that will be put in those places. But some other places, and many would agree that in the northeast, in this area where there's a lot of significant energy development happening, fracking in particular, this could be seen as a priority area. And I'm not sure where the resources would come for that. So those components are for sure there, and in addition, there is a huge, what I'm calling a data gap, which again is consistent with what Roger laid out in his component, in his discussion, is that in many places we don't even know what the challenges are. So without knowing what the challenges are, hard to talk about what resources will be needed to fix them. So this governance reform component of it will be a critical component. But, as it often comes back to, it's back to this political thing. To what extent will this remain a priority for the politicians? Again, as I tried to capture in my opening remarks, 2008, 2009, the world was a very different place about what role government was going to play on an important file like water, others as well. I think that's a different place now, so I think that there's a lot of process in finding the feet. So, long answer to a good question. Short answer, there is no analysis yet because we don't know what's coming yet.
And Laura, I'll just sign off with a very quick note. I'm involved with a public policy course being offered to people in the nonprofit sector under the flag of the Max Bell Foundation. And we were at a meeting last week, and 20 participants were trying to refine their ask to government. And a number of the participants were from watershed councils. And the general advice that the course instructors were giving to the participants was, if your ask involves more money, this is going to be a very, very tough time to be successful. And so in an area in a time of government retrenchment, things that cost more are just going to get bounced, to the bottom of the deck, and it's quite worrisome because this has not been an area that has been overfunded in the past, but it's going to get tough. Anyway, I will sign off at this point. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Roger. And just so those of you know, Larissa is staying on the line. I know there's still some questions coming in, so thanks very much, Roger.
Just to pick up on Roger's point, though, and I think, and it relates again to some of the themes that the Canada West and certainly POLIS has been working on for a long time, and that relates to pricing and valuing water. And I think that these are not the same thing, pricing and value not the same thing, but it's important that there be an opportunity to capture some revenue for these important governance elements when you're talking about that. Pricing can be used as a tool. We have a whole series of work done under the umbrella of what we call conservation-oriented water pricing. The idea that by providing a price signal that it creates huge incentives to innovate and to reduce, but in addition it offers an opportunity to capture some revenue and cover some of the full costs. Certainly in big infrastructure fields like in municipal water, that's a critical component, and that's something that Canada certainly is only in the very nascent stages, where many places, certainly in Europe and other places around the world, have a great deal of experience with some success.
Okay, there's another question in from the folks at WWF. This is going back to the first question about how the future report will be used. Larissa, regarding water stress points, are you using the stress points already identified in the Can West report and the experts?
Yes. In the case of our new project, the the way that we're defining stress points, we don't have an exact definition yet, but in the case of this project, it's looking at where industry or, for example, industry or agriculture, where the areas that may be ripe for conflict in the future will be. So some of them are the obvious ones, like the Okanagan Basin. What will happen if water conflicts continue, or water shortages continue, or looking at southern Alberta, looking at Lake Winnipeg. So we're looking at specific examples, and then all the stakeholders involved. What are the issues? How does government make decisions in terms of deciding what are the trade-offs? Who should get the water? What are the most important priorities? In our original report, The Wave of the Future, we were more looking at what are the overarching policy concerns. So there is a slight difference between those two.
Great, thanks. Next question from Karen Nicorak. What steps or roles can water stewards, community groups, take to foster shared decision-making and collaborative watershed governance?
So I'll pick up on that. I mean, that question is absolutely central to this event that will be happening in Vancouver, I guess, next week, which I have to now, as soon as I'm off the call here, I'll begin preparing my next presentation. I think it's a big open question. I think that it's a good question because what it represents is a maturation in the field where we're beginning to ask these questions. 10 years ago, we would not have even asked this question because I don't think we were ready as Canadians, maybe in a few regional pockets, but as a widespread discussion, the idea that playing an active and a critical role in shared decision-making, how does one do that? Who are the key actors and who needs to be at the table, and what are the elements they're going to need to be successful? And I think that's some of the elements that can be done. Certainly is gathering a lot of very credible and objective knowledge about the state of the resource. Number two is increasing the awareness of the broader community. So Roger alluded to this political conundrum. Well, politics are driven by priorities that are set out by the communities and constituencies. Raising the awareness and the issues around water issues is one of the best ways to make it a political issue, absolutely. I think the other one is really getting that house in order, making sure that there are good, credible, accountable processes, even from the very small, and I'm involved with NGOs from the small, local ones all the way up to the big national ones, having really credible and useful civil society and NGO groups that can engage and really capture the sentiment of this broader constituency is critical for building this legitimacy and playing an active role as citizens and as these sort of critical catalysts of change to ensuring that government opens up the processes. This is a new frontier, and government isn't yet entirely comfortable, and the institutions aren't yet in place that will enable this kind of sharing of decision-making, because in some cases, the sharing of decision-making means also the sharing of the accountability for those decisions, and that's the real challenge. I hope that answers it.
The next question coming in is from Sean Peck. In BC, and probably everywhere, most surface and groundwater that does not evaporate or be recycled ends up in the ocean. Are these policy discussions mainly involved with surface and groundwater governance? Should this be clarified in the discussions?
I'm not totally understanding the question, so maybe you could elaborate a little more. Obviously, watersheds are ecological units. There's a critical role that water plays in and of itself ecologically, including in the estuaries as they reach the ocean. So there's an important ecological component to both surface and groundwater and also atmospheric water. The discussions, I think, are beginning to move towards this more integrated perspective. Certainly in British Columbia, largely it has been about surface water and about a subset primarily called drinking water. But again, that's all elements in a larger cycle. So I think that's part of the tension, and that's, obviously for us at the POLIS project on ecological governance, the idea of this integrated element is such a critical driver, and that's what is sort of missing, and we need to expand on this.
Okay, thanks, Oliver. I think that that's likely the last question. One hasn't rolled in for a little while, so I want to extend a big thank you to Roger, who had to leave, as well as Oliver, and to Larissa for lending her expertise and voice to the discussion period here. And I also want to thank all of you for being on the line. Before I let you go, I want to mention our upcoming webinars. There has been a bit of a switch. The March webinar was going to be the Watershed Governance in the 21st Century focus. However, we've flipped our next two webinars. So on March 7th, we'll be joined by Ben Parfit, who will be talking about the water energy nexus. And I'll, of course, be sending out reminders closer to the date. So thanks very much. Oliver, did you have anything more you wanted to add?
Sure, I'll just further plug. So Karen, your question, and I think is a critical one, in fact, may help shape that. That's exactly what I hope to tackle in the May webinar, which will capture some of what I think the important learnings and elements from the event in the end of January. And in fact, it probably won't be me as the primary speaker. We'll probably bring in some folks to give you some different perspectives, and I'll probably play a role as well. So I think that may be something that will be of particular interest. And just as another note, some of the elements that I mentioned in my presentation, and I'm sure Laura can provide additional, we have a number of other webinars such as the public trust doctrine, a few others that are themes that we discussed today if people wanted to learn more.
Laura, I just wanted to mention just to everybody, if anyone has other questions, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is on our website, cwf.ca, and we have some other water publications on there as well.
Great. Thank you for that, Larissa. Okay, I think that about does us for this webinar session. Hopefully, I'll see a lot of you again in March. And I will be in touch about when the recording is posted and also about the upcoming webinars as we discussed. So take care and have a really good day.